Welcome to this conversation for change in partnership with Independent Lens Town Hall in a Box. I'm Dr. Kay Wise Whitehead, the founding director of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice, and the radio host of Today with Dr. K on WEAA. Now, I want you to understand that we are in for a lively discussion tonight. A very passionate and probably emotional topic. And we want to note that this is a safe space for communication. So listening is valued as much as talking. We encourage you to begin the discussion in the chat section. Tell us who you are and where you're chiming in from. We want to open up the environment for everyone. Town Hall in the Box events are grounded in active peace. We want to get to the root of conflict by focusing on active solutions. This is one of two events focused on the show Philly DA and a critical conversation around the American justice system. So we are so glad that you are here. As part of the event, we are including a new tool to measure social impact. We had one previous event for episode 1 of Philly DA, rejoining the events upholding in Philly today with episode 7. We want to hear what you think about ideas raised by Philly DA. Now, there have been a lot of conversations about this show. New York Magazine said that this is the only show since The Wire to truly dig into the working of big systems and the individuals who push against them. I'm joining in from Baltimore, Maryland, so any association with The Wire definitely makes me excited to think about delving deeper into the series. And Vulture said that Philly DA, it never steps inside a courtroom. There are no surprise witnesses, no brutal cross-examination, no stunning verdicts, but it is as captivating, timely, and relevant a legal drama as you're likely to watch this spring. Now, almost everyone who shared feedback after our last Philly DA event indicated that they felt the criminal justice system was unfair, while many indicated it was very unfair. Folks also shared their ideas for reforming the criminal legal system and expressed strong support for restorative justice, improved police training, and an end to cash bail, with one viewer from Baltimore, Maryland sharing, "Get rid of cash bail. It basically forces people, innocent or guilty, to start serving time before they have even had a trial." Now, do you have any other ideas about how we should reform the criminal legal system? Do you want to join the conversation about reform in your community? Simply click the share your feedback button above. Now, first, we'd like to get you involved right away with the polling question. It's a yes or no question, and it's really easy, but we want you to click when you see it. Is civic engagement a high priority for you? Just click yes or no, and we will reveal the results of the poll later in the event. We thank you so much for participating in our first poll question. Is civic engagement a high priority for you? I'm joined tonight for this discussion, first by LaTanya Myers, a formerly incarcerated person turned activist and the first ever bail navigator for the Defender Association of Philadelphia, a position to help those arrested navigate the bail review system. She currently works as a support coordinator with the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund. She started a new organization to help others who are system impacted above all odds, and she regards herself as a revolutionary community activist. LaTanya, can you just frame the discussion for us tonight through the lens of Philly DA?
Yes, first I'd like to say thank you so much, Dr. K. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about these serious issues that affect everyone, not only in Philadelphia, but all across the nation. Philly DA is a opportunity for individuals to see what happens not only in the district attorney's office, but also in the communities every day. With organizations fighting to hold people accountable the same way that the system takes oaths to hold us accountable. As throughout this series, you'll see that we're fighting the in-cash bail. 90% of the individuals that's in custody at this moment in Philadelphia are held pre-trial. They're not convicted of any crimes. They simply cannot afford to purchase their freedom. Been through that part of our history. Individuals have to purchase their freedom in order to just, be citizens. So we hope to allow individuals to see the similarities of what happened in the past so that we won't continue to allow it to happen in the future, so that we hold our police officers accountable. We have to pay attention to budget hearings. We have to know that this Philly DA series, you can look at who's responsible for the harm that's being perpetuated in the community, and those that's most impacted by the problem is often closest to the solution. So if given an opportunity, and if they're endorsed, if they understood, and if they're given an opportunity to lead, it would lead us in the right direction. And that's further towards healing for our communities throughout.
Thank you. I'm also joined by Dr. Keisha Middlemas. She's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University and the author of Convicted and Condemned: The Politics and Policies of Prisoner Reentry. She's also a member of the Racial Democracy, Crime, and Justice. So, Dr. Keisha, could you provide for us an overview of American policing so we can understand and be engaged in what is happening here?
Of course, it's fabulous to be on the stage with you again. So when we think about American policing, we have to think that in the northern cities like New York and Chicago and Philadelphia, you can trace the policing history back to its English roots. With these centralized local police departments, they're local. And then we also have to think about the policing in the South, which really evolved as a function of slave patrols and were used to protect white communities and their property, including controlling and catching slaves that attempted to escape. So in both instances, policing in northern cities and policing in southern areas, is the police were used to protect property, to enforce the color line, to enforce Jim Crow policies between whites and non-whites. And we now see the same type of tactics and behaviors used today by police departments across the country as an institution. They continue to protect property, and they continue to uphold the racial differences or racialized communities. So marginalized communities are policed in a much different way than white communities. And the tactics and practices like surveillance, traffic stop and frisk are really used based on racial identity of the individual in the community, and the police identify people based on their race. And we really do see this with police stops that end up, unfortunately, killing Black men, women, and instances where children are in the car. And we saw this, of course, erupt in nationwide marches where people of all different races, creeds, religions were literally on the street exclaiming and telling people that Black lives do matter.
Thank you. And I want to invite our last participant to our discussion, Dr. Uhuru Williams, an American academic, an author, and activist. He is Distinguished University Chair and Professor of History and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. In 2009, Diverse Magazine named Dr. Williams as one of the top 10 emerging scholars under 40. Dr. Williams, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I just want to ask if you can just kind of provide for us an understanding of how the Academy is meeting activists at this moment.
Good to see you, Dr. K. And it's a great question because I think what the Academy is doing is wedding theory like critical race theory to the struggles that people like Ms. Latanya are engaged in the street. Activists who are making it a priority to really have us reimagine the criminal justice system away from the roots that Dr. Keisha described. The reality is for most Americans, they think about policing in a context that's divorced from its historical connection to slavery, white supremacy, and ultimately the maintenance of a domination over communities of color, specifically African Americans. So when Ms. Latanya makes the case tonight that we have to look at and appreciate how policing can't deviate far from its roots, a large part of that reform requires us to do things like historical recovery. How do we connect in very tangible ways the history of slave patrols to modern policing today? How do we get people to appreciate, for example, here in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Police Force was founded in 1867 in the aftermath of the Civil War. The first Black officer here in Minneapolis wasn't allowed to carry a firearm because of fear of the white community and how the white community would fear about that. So even then, you were second-class citizens and second-class peace officers. Race is the third rail in American politics for a reason, but it has been a major factor in the way that we think about American society and culture in all aspects of life. When we think about criminal justice and the role that it plays in a civil society, at the end of the day, it's the work that Dr. Keisha does that, when you wed to the activism of people like Ms. Latanya, puts us in the best position not to think about how we reform policing, but how we reimagine it. And this is a moment of reimagination.
And that's interesting that you said that, Dr. Uhuru, this moment of reimagination. Ms. Latanya, I want to come back to you because it feels like people are having a difficult time trying to reimagine policing, that people see it as the way it's always been established as a problem. The police show up, guns blazing sometime to bring order. But when we look at what that means for Black and Brown people, what does reimagining the police look like for you?
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you, Dr. Williams, for eloquently, bringing that to the audience, and thank you also. When we talk about reimagining, we have to first, I believe, what makes us feel safe in our own communities. So many times these policies get passed over our heads and they don't come to our community and ask us what makes us feel safe. It's not the police sometimes, is when you're in a community, especially urban communities, we're waiting for the bus. A police officer is not going to say hi or hello or are you running late? They're most likely thinking you're standing on a corner selling drugs. And that's a problem. That's a problem, the culture of it, and the way, and for our community to understand where it stems from, is conservative political parties, terrorist units. That's what red shirt militia and the red shirts steam that took over Wilmington in the 1800s, right? These red shirt militias that was legalized terror within our community. And we have to stop that. We have to reimagine that. It was built. We can't reform it. We have to stop it because it was built on white supremacy. It was built to oppress us. It was built to keep us down. And I think when our community, start to go to budget hearings and watch how the police departments lie and ask for these $700 million budgets, claiming that they're keeping our community safer, but they're not. They're prosecuting, they're killing us. $700 million just this month, our police department advocated for, saying that it is in the best interest of us. But they didn't say take a quarter of that and put it into the schools. And the problem, we need to really, continue to be civically engaged and hold our police departments accountable the same way that they hold us accountable. Arbitrary hearings. We don't know what happens when we file a complaint against a police officer, because the same people that judge the arbitrators are the same people that the police officers pay. So we got to follow the money. We got to understand, and that's our taxpayers' money. We have to understand and make sure that every time we buy a soda, every time we buy a candy bar, that candy bar and that soda is to pay our police to protect our children, not hurt or kill them, to say hello, not put your hands behind your back. And I just hope that our community stays civically engaged in a way where we dismantle this system and build one that is truly meant to protect us.
Now, Dr. Uhuru, I'll come back to you because I think that Ms. Latanya touches on something. This idea that every dollar that we spend, a candy bar, every time you get something, it goes to fund policing. But in places like Baltimore City, where we're spending 4 or 5 times as much on policing than we do on education. And even when we look to reform, as we did last year, we cut out, $22 million, and the new mayor put back in $28 million. So you gave them what you took, and then you gave them more, and our communities are still not safe. So can you kind of unpack that for us? Because people kind of see it as give the police more money and you have more protection, but it doesn't work like that.
And it never has, Dr. K, and I think that's part of the problem. We saw that here in Minneapolis. Anybody who watched the trial of Derek Chauvin, when you saw those people on that street corner at 38th in Chicago pleading for George Floyd's life, that's the end of the cycle that begins with the predatory lending practices that deny African Americans access to home ownership. It is the unfair pricing system where a Cup Foods that exists on that corner is mandating that its employees chase people down for a counterfeit $20 bill. It's Alicia Euler, the young woman working at the service station across the street, who's making up titles for the work that she does because ultimately she drops out of school in the 11th grade. This is a massive failure of American systems at every level. And when Ms. Latanya, I think, eloquently makes the case that if we focus narrowly on policing and we don't look at how this is an interlocking system of white supremacy that has failed Americans, because I think that's the problem where most people in the mainstream lose sight of. The tragedy of 38th in Chicago is, if you think about those people who are pleading for George Floyd's life, who's there? It's African Americans and women. What does that point to? How women and people of color and children in our larger society and culture are silenced. 38th in Chicago is a microcosm of America. When I watch this case of Philadelphia, this man who has to take a pistol with him to sell a motorbike, and the DA's office acknowledges that that's the reality of what it's like in inner city Philadelphia. And oh, by the way, we know that's the reality in inner city St. Paul, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, Bridgeport, Wilmington, Delaware, Washington, D.C., insert any large community of color where Black and brown people are today, then that's an abrogation of the social compact. The police are not fulfilling the basic thing that we ask of them to serve and protect. And so then you come to the conclusion that Ms. Latanya has, and I think that most activists are in this space now. Take that money and put it into education programs so we can make sure students graduate from the 12th grade so that there's not chronic underemployment, that health disparities don't ravage our communities. And oh, by the way, in terms of dealing with and addressing the issues of predatory lending and predatory businesses that emerge in our community and overcharge, let's do away with that too by creating pathways to business ownership. A really deep investment in community and not more investment in the hardware of policing our communities the way that an army occupies territory. We're American citizens, not territories.
Oh, so Dr. Keisha, then that does lead to a question for you, because I know this is your research area. To help us understand what Dr. Uhuru said about these interlocking systems, to help us to try to understand that this is an American system, even though we are Americans, as Dr. Uhuru said, but it's rooted in white supremacy. It's rooted in us being second-class citizens. So just because Derek Chauvin goes to jail doesn't mean police brutality is going to stop. And just because you pump $1 million into Baltimore City doesn't mean you're going to get rid of fast food swamps and fresh fruit deserts. So can you talk about the system itself that's built on white supremacy and then how policing comes out of that?
Yes, indeed. So two great points that I would like to link. When we think about police budgets, when we think about to protect and serve, I always ask myself, who is being protected and who is being served? Who is the us in the conversation about, well, we're here to protect you? And I'm like, well, who's the you? We, and who's the we? I always want to know who is that conversation being directed to? And I think that's really important when we look at the history of policing, but also policing today. Is the police as a large unit, as an institution, target individuals of color. That there's just facts to demonstrate that the targeted communities are communities of color. And we also then have to look at police as this continuum of punishment in this country. So police for me is the entry point. Usually it's the entry point into the criminal justice system, but you have to think about it on a continuum where you don't get arrested unless the police do it. You don't go and get actually prosecuted unless the police arrest you. You don't serve time in jail or prison until you have interactions with the police. Like, we don't skip over the police to get into the other parts of the criminal justice system. And my own research, but lots of other people demonstrate that the criminal justice system in the United States was a two-part system. So during slavery, there was a criminal justice system for white people, and you were enslaved if you were Black. Post-slavery, we had then a distinct shift in policies, a distinct shift in state constitutions that evolved this idea of punishment for some people and other people would get a slap on the wrist. And then post-civil rights movement, we now have new policies called the war on drugs. And we see that play out today with this idea that LaTanya talked about, that when Black people are standing on a corner waiting for the bus, the police make the assumption they're dealing drugs. When white people stand at the bus stop, well, they're going to work. And this assumption about who is valued in the community, how the police view us as part of the larger milieu of media, of what we're taught in schools, the investment of dollars, and how Black people are viewed as other in so many different ways and interactions that it's impossible to get under and out from the institutions that implement and really just uphold white supremacy.
So before we go to the audience questions, I want to come back to you, Ms. LaTanya, because 83% of the people who are watching tonight say that civic engagement is a high priority for them. But last year, after the murder of George Floyd, everyone was very interested in what I call Black Lives Matter 2.0, right? And I'd like to tell people it didn't just start there, that for some people it just began. For others, we have been doing this work. But that interest in Black Lives Matter was over 70% in this country. Like everybody said, Black Lives Matter. And they were willing to come out of the global pandemic, march. I mean, they were drinking, cafe lattes, marching down the streets. They had their children involved. But then September came. And then you got caught up in possibly going back to work, and they saw interest in Black Lives Matter drop from 70% down to less than 20% because there was almost 60% drop of interest in the white community. So we're saying we're interested in civic engagement. So can you talk, Ms. LaTanya, about what exactly does civic engagement look like?
Again, thank you so much for that question. It's important. I want to first honor all our ancestors and elders that laid the foundation that we stand on. We can only see further if we stand on the shoulders of giants. And I just want to say, for my generation, for myself, for who I can speak for, my generation, my peers, this was an eye-opening, last 2 years for us. Sometimes it's always that spark that gets people going, right? That understanding that we never thought that we'll be marching, down Broad Street like they was marching down Salem, arm to arm, make it, right? But this is something that we take pride in. But and including in that pride, we have to take priority in educating ourselves and which ways that we can stay civically engaged. If they know the rules that govern us, we have to learn and know the rules that govern them. And that's how we do it through civic engagement. We have to understand why we're out there marching. We have to understand and know, just like when the playoff games is coming, we got to know when our local DA elections is coming up, because we can have DAs that's going to stand and look in and see the camera and say, you shot that man in the back. This is cold-blooded. I'm not going to cover it up. That's what we need, because we elect our officials. A lot of people don't know that we elect our judges, the same judges that want to allow our mothers to speak for us, that's crying in court, won't allow our mothers to hug us and kiss us before they carry us off out into the country. Mm-hmm. We elect them. So I think once we connect those two together, that passion, that eager understanding, that wanting for change, and transform that into action and tangible goals, and watch parties for elections so that we can, celebrate as we get our people from our community elected. Like back in the day, I learned that Thurgood Marshall took a plea and he said, I can't go to an integrated school, but I'm gonna become an attorney and I'm going to make sure that those, that's what he did, right? And that's what we need to raise. We need to raise young leaders that say, I'm going to be the president. I'm going to be, not only the president, I'm going to be the governor, the mayor. I'm going to be the person that appoints and give out the budget. I know that my city is not getting it. I know what gerrymandering does to our communities when you take our people and our men from our communities and you count them in the census in rural areas, right? We know where those money and that bucks go. So once we start understanding that, I think it would be just an amazing moment, so that we can push this forward for the next generation to lay the foundation and make it easier I'm sorry, y'all, I just get passionate, but that's
I mean, I feel like we're in church. I want to say amen, Miss Latanya, only because I think all three of us are sitting here smiling, because I definitely believe what John Lewis said. Like, we need the passion and the energy of our youth to keep us going forward. That, we get to a point, I know for me, get to a point that I'm probably not going to be leading too many marches in the streets anymore. I want my sons to go out there and I'll write the check. I'll make sure you have coffee, blankets, and bail money. But we need your energy to keep it going forward. Which, Dr. Uhuru, I come back to you. Because when I'm listening to Latanya, and I love that reference to Thurgood Marshall, it made me think about James Baldwin, who said that we carry our past with us, that we are our past in living present moments. And with our audience questions kind of coming into this, one of our audience questions speaks directly to that notion of connecting it all. So this point around restorative justice, and how do we come to grips with that? And how do we reimagine policing and accountability at this moment, which is perhaps a little bit different than how we imagined it during the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement. Maybe it's a little bit different than how we imagined it during Black Lives Matter 1.0, before we started wrestling with Donald Trump and his legacy. So now, what does restorative justice look like?
It's such a great question, Dr. K, because I think about Baldwin's comment that the world changes according to the way people see it. Mm-hmm. If you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. Mm-hmm. What I love about Ms. Latanya is that she defines herself as a revolutionary community activist. Now, people hear the word revolution and they get uncomfortable, like the word defund. But revolution simply means change. So she's a change agent. And when she says reimagine, she's saying, let's alter the way that we're thinking about the way that systems work presently, because they don't have to work that way. No one mandates that the way that the system presently operates has to be the only way. The assumption that police need to be armed to the teeth is a misconception. The notion that we've leveraged technology in so many ways that are invasive of our privacy. And yet I think about the killing of Dante Wright here in Minnesota at Brooklyn Center. There was no reason in the world that those police officers needed to arrest him at that time. During the middle of a pandemic, you've got officers pressed to pull somebody over and arrest them on an outstanding warrant that began because they were looking for something to do on a Sunday afternoon and settled on him having something in his windshield. These are practices that don't privilege restoration of harmony in the community. These are practices that criminalize not only spaces inhabited by people of color, but literally Black and brown bodies in this country. Our bodies have become criminalized, literally. And so in that sense, when we talk about restorative justice, we talk about not just the process of reform again, but this whole idea that we call into question the very foundations of every system as it is presently constituted. We can rethink education and pathways to education. Universal pre-K should be a right for Americans. We should reimagine healthcare in this country. And I'm not talking about Obamacare either. I'm talking about bottom-up reimagination of healthcare. And when it comes to prisons and public safety, Dr. Keisha, your book is phenomenal in so many ways, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, but I know you agree. Part of the challenge here too is that the assumption is that this is the way that we've been doing it, and then the police union gets involved and the politicians get involved, and no one then has the will to step in and say, wait, who says clear the deck, wipe everything off the board and start again? This formula is not working.
Mm-hmm. So Dr. Keisha, then that leads me back to you. One of our audience members wanted to talk about sustaining energy and volunteerism when there's not a recent tragedy. And I wanted to just frame that, because one of the few things that I think that Donald Trump brought to the table, I mean, with all the craziness, but he held people to the point where they had to be accountable. Like, there were 4 years when you could not look away. You had to get out. You had to go to the streets. You had to stay active. And he kept the temperature so high that if you stopped for a moment, then the world had moved on, that people were engaged in conversations about politics in ways I've never heard before. I mean, I'm used to the conversations with my mom. I was having conversations with 7-year-olds who could talk about Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump is no longer president. We now have a president who has kind of put his foot on the brake, calmed things all the way back down, and people are not as engaged as they were because there are no crazy tweets. There is nothing happening immediately. There's no, big push to buy Greenland, right? There's none of that happening. So you can go on with your life. So how do we sustain energy and volunteerism when someone is not being killed and we're watching the video? When the president is just kind of decide and announcing and being very calm? How do we keep people passionately involved?
I think this becomes a question of what do we care about as individuals? Do we care about community? And if you care about community, then you can make a difference, and you don't have to be out there marching. You don't have to be out there constantly sort of on a bullhorn, getting people to change their minds. But it's about having those small conversations. You call out and help any Black or brown people that you work with. Don't make that Black or brown person the voice of everybody, but you can speak up at work, or at least whenever we go back to the offices. You can engage in small ways by educating other people about what you've learned about Black Lives Matter and what defund the police is a slogan, but find out and read what does defund the police actually mean, and then educate people that we're not talking about like, oh, we're just going to take all the money away. In some instances, some people want to take all the money away. But there's other instances where people are talking about the police don't need $8 billion or $8 million or $800,000. Let them work on a smaller budget, make them make priorities like every other government building, government program, government entity, and then reinvest that money into communities. And if you have a skill, and everybody's got different skills, so if you know how to read, why don't you then volunteer at a reading program or an after school program? So volunteering does not mean or civic engagement does not just mean marching, but it also goes to what LaTanya talked about, is educate yourself about local elections. Mm-hmm. Hang out at a budget hearing of your city. Find out where the city is putting your tax dollars. It is finding out what's going on in your local community and just make small effort. And that will then be sustainable versus having to look at a moment that sparks everybody's energy. We can look for moments in small ways to actually help those that are directly in our community or those that are adjacent to our communities.
Thank you. Ms. LaTanya, I want to come to you because I'm thinking a lot about the notion of justice. And I know that everybody has a different definition of justice. For some people, it's about let's get the cops to stop killing us. For other people, they're like, well, no, we need to have more money in schools. For folks somewhere in Baltimore, it's like we need to get the lead out of the soil so we can save the next generation. Then when we start thinking about this huge word called justice, as we apply it to the areas where you do your revolutionary community activist work, what does justice look like from your perspective? And you're on mute, and so I'd like to ask him to, there you go, no problem.
So when we talk about justice, I remember the first time staring up at City Hall in Philadelphia, and it's a beautiful building. And on one side, you got Moses with the 10 Commandments. And on the other side, you got Lady Liberty Justice, right? You got Lady Justice. And she's blindfolded. And she has the scales, right? And I looked and I said, well, they look at my skin color. These are algorithms, like the system and the judges, they're not blindfolded. This is not justice. And just to bring it back, I think when we talk about like these punitive charges, like when we talk about with our police officers, it's a whole qualified immunity. Why do you need qualified immunity if you say that you have integrity, that you have morals, right? Just like any other person that steps outside, you're going to think twice if that's your son. Why do you have to shoot to kill? You know what I mean? That's not justice when we talk about like qualified immunity and things like that. We need healing. We can bring the healing, and we can have our community collectively govern ourselves with the trust and with the assistance of, you know, different things. But I'm saying just trust us to come back and understand that we can do the healing. We don't need people to knock us upside our heads or drag our mothers and our fathers off to jail, or our kids for that matter. You know, justice is not a one-sided issue. And when we talk about justice, I think Dr. Williams so eloquently put it. And when we talk about, we can't look at justice on a system that was built on racist, white supremacy, right? We have to go back. It's like Joe Biden, we talk about Joe Biden and how everything is quiet. No, we should be riled up about that crime bill that he passed that have yet to reverse, right? So he can do that. He can reverse that crime bill that is still having so many people incarcerated to life for nonviolent offenders, you know? So let's talk about reversing that crime bill that got so many of our kids and our brothers and our sons locked in jail. We can't move forward and say we're for change and want to do better without first coming to the grips with the harm that we caused. So let's talk about reversing that bill. Let's talk about restoring that justice to those that you hurt. You know, when you was, you know, people was locking us up when we needed help in the 1980s.
Right.
Let's talk about bringing healing before we can talk about justice.
Now, Dr. Uhuru, then I come to you. I mean, Ms. Latanya has just laid the groundwork for this question, because justice, just us, and whether or not it's possible. Under the previous administration, 45 appointed over 200 federal judges to lifetime appointments. And then this is remarkable and astonishing, because you're talking at this point, 80 to 85% of the current judges were appointed by him. So he was pushing through judges with kind of a green check mark because of Senate. So can we get justice when you look at the gatekeepers for whether or not we get a month, no time, or lifetime in jail, particularly because he set up justices on the federal appeals level, which are the gatekeepers for each region. And for Trump, 85% of the judges were white, male, conservative. So how do we get justice going into a system where he might be gone, but those gatekeepers are there that could potentially impact not just us, but our children and their children?
It's a phenomenal question, and I think that's why the discourse around defund the police is so important. It's not a question of reform, because that's a system by its very nature that's broken. I love that Ms. Latanya brought up the imagery of the statuary that's in downtown Philadelphia. And so you've got Moses and you've got Lady Liberty, but who stands above all of them? The highest point in the city is the statue of Billy Penn. So a white man is still on top, and a white man still making decisions. The white man puts the symbols of justice up and then ultimately tells you those are the symbols of justice, but it's the human being that's placed above them that ultimately makes those decisions. And I say that not to be, people would sometimes see that as a divisive thing to say, but that's the reality of what white supremacy looks like. People are unsettled by that, but that is the reality of why we have to talk about white supremacy. It's at the core of what James Baldwin meant when he wrote, "The only way to police the ghetto is to be oppressive." And when you're then talking about appointing judges in a system that at its core can't operate in any other way than that way, then you have to dismantle the system. That's where we wind up. It always comes back to that point of, why are we bound to this? We know the problems inherent in the way that it's presently constructed. To continue to assume that putting different faces in those places, look, Keonga Taylor wrote about this with regard to Baltimore. Where were we in the moment when Freddie Gray was killed and you've got a black police chief and a black mayor? And she wrote, we're at a whole new stage in the black freedom struggle when you have black. Now, I would argue, based on what Baltimore did this past year in terms of getting rid of qualified immunity, well, that's the difference that black lawmakers can make. That's why we have to do what Ms. Latanya was suggesting in terms of going after the political process and being part of this participatory democracy. But at the same time, and I want to be clear about this, we always talk about people at the margins. Margins are drawn. and margins can be erased.
Mm.
It takes imagination to pick up the instruments, the tools to do that, and to begin to color outside the lines.
Mm.
Lines become bars for communities of color. Let's erase those lines.
I like that. And just bringing Baltimore into the conversation, I really have to just give a moment of credit to State Senator Jill P. Carter. I mean, she did the long, hard work to try to get rid of this crime bill that has been so restrictive. It's been so difficult to remove here in Baltimore City because Baltimore City is a microcosm of America because you have so many Black faces in positions of power. And then you look around and say, then why do we still have, and you can fill in all the issues because you have to take it back to what Dr. Uhura said in the beginning. Hey, you're talking about a system built on white supremacy. So you can have Black faces in high spaces. You can have kinfolk who are not skin folk, as Zora Neale Hurston would say, and you can still have oppressive conditions for Black people. Dr. Keisha, there's a book that just came out by Rosa Brooks. She's a Georgetown professor. And when she joined the police academy, she said, you can only find out about policing by really going through and looking at what they do. And the book is called Tangled Up in Blue. She talked about having two profound truths, and I want to lay out the truths and have you speak to them. She said, on one hand, you have a police system that is rooted in divisions around class and race. And you have a violent police system that's more violent than most countries. So if you are Black or brown or economically challenged, your interactions with the police are more than likely going to end up with a violent interaction at the end. And then there's this other truth, where an overwhelming majority of police officers will never pull their gun on a person, who are out there, finding lost kids, taking cats out of trees, getting people to the hospital. But the reality is that we sit in the middle of both of these truths as Black and brown people in this country. So can you help us to unpack, how do we make sense of this in a place where we don't feel protected when the police show up?
Right. So there's multiple interwoven issues. And I think the important thing to think about is the idea that there are certain number of police officers that continuously are written up for violating individuals' rights. We call them in the media, they're called bad apples. But the fact is there's lots of bad apples because the police won't call out their other members, the blue wall of silence, but also that somebody who shoots an unarmed civilian, a police officer that shoots an unarmed civilian, is more likely to then shoot someone else. We saw that in episode 7 with the individual that was killed and shot in the back. That police officer had shot someone else prior to 2 years before. So these things don't come out of nowhere. And so what I would like to see is it's not just qualified immunity, but it is disentangling the current police union contracts. They have to be renegotiated with city mayors, with city councils, where police officers are not protected. There's recent media coming out that the unions are trying to take an affirmative step so that they're not completely overturned by elected officials or new elected officials. But the idea is the police unions, a bunch of other laws, most DAs, protect the bad actors within the police department. And in order to then separate the bad actors, they must be held accountable, hence what Ms. LaTanya talked about in qualified immunity. The police almost should be treated like doctors. They got to go get different type of insurance if they want to practice. And they need to be held accountable in the same way that doctors are held accountable when they make mistakes. And I'm putting mistakes in quotations because when police take out their gun, they now have deadly force, and that's a permanent mistake that can't be fixed. I'd like to make one final point on this issue of justice. When I teach about justice, I always get students to quantify and tell me what kind of justice are they talking about. Are they talking about procedural justice? Everybody's treated the same. Are they talking about distributive justice, where the judges are determining punishment and are people treated the same? Are they talking about retributive punishment, or are they talking about restorative justice, which is about the restoration of communities? When we use the amorphous term justice, we're really not narrowing down the conversation. That I want to talk about restorative justice. I want to talk about procedural justice. Treat me like you treat white people.
Mm. Yes. I mean, you sound like my Nana there. I mean, my Nana used to always say, look, we don't want, we're not saying treat us better than, just treat us the same as. And that has always been the struggle around what it means to be Black in America. It's the struggle around Dred Scott and having no rights that white men are bound to respect. It's the struggle around Plessy saying set up separate but equal, and then that ends up being cement fountains and porcelain fountains. It's the struggle around every single act that's happening in this country and has been happening. It's a struggle now with the way they're watering down the Voting Rights Act. I think that what it means to be treated the same as is about the extension of humanity, and that is what is lacking in the treatment of Black people when we have interactions with the police. I know our conversation is wrapping up. I want to go to each panelist and just have them kind of bring in one thing that we didn't add to the conversation. And I want to begin with Miss LaTanya Myers, a formerly incarcerated person turned activist and the first ever bail navigator for the Defender Association in Philadelphia. She currently works as a support coordinator with the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund. She defines herself as a revolutionary community activist, and I agree. Ms. LaTanya?
Wow, I was speechless. I was so humbled, Dr. Key. Thank you so much. First, I would like to say, if anybody would like to get in touch, continue this conversation off of here, you can reach me at abovealrodds.org. Again, that's abovealrodds.org. I'm always open to share my story or, talk with other people that we can push this conversation further. I think Dr. Williams said something great when he said, why do we have to have rules, right? Who said that we have to have our Supreme Court sit there for the next 20 years? We can change that. We need to understand that we have the provision to change these laws, and let's start talking about it. Let's start reversing it. Biden, let's reverse this Crime Act bill that you put. Get at me. But I just want to say thank y'all so much. Use your privilege in ways where if you understand that something has happened, don't be a part of the system. Whistleblow it. Let us know. Let us know why we didn't get that promotion. Let us know that slide talk or what they're saying in the back rooms about us, and the way we eat or the way our food smell in the office when we heat it up, right? If you're complacent with that, you're a part of the problem. Give your skills to someone that's, formerly incarcerated. Reach out, share a book, share some understanding. And that's all that we ask, is that you uplift our impacted leaders, endorse them the same way that we endorse and yell the names of our elected officials. We need people to understand and fight for us as well. And I just thank y'all so much for this great conversation that I learned so much from. And I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. LaTanya. I want to go to Dr. Keisha Middlemass, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University, and they're killing the game right now with Felicia Rashad, and the author of Convicted and Condemned, The Politics and Policies of Prisoner Reentry. She's also a member of the Racial Democracy, Crime and Justice Organization. Dr. Keisha?
Thank you so much. And I want to thank my panelists. This was a great conversation. I think for those that want to be involved, an easy way, if you are privileged and have the means to do so, is donate to bail funds that actually target individuals who are poor, have not been convicted, haven't even been put to trial yet, but are poor and cannot go home because a week, 6 weeks, however long that they stay in jail while they wait their trial, individuals' lives can completely fall apart. So I know there's Mother's Day and Father's Day, but what I'm asking people to do is do it on a monthly basis. Don't just donate when there's a holiday, but do it on a monthly basis. Make it like a tithing ritual that you can literally help poor people not sit in jail waiting for the criminal justice system to actually then process them. Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, Dr. Uhuru Williams, an American academic, an author, and an activist. He's a distinguished university chair and professor of history and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. Dr. Williams?
A couple of things. I think we do have to educate, deliberate. I just picked up Dr. Keisha's book last week, and couldn't put it down. I mean, so people will direct you toward a Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, or an Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's important. But in order to do the work, you have to understand how the systems work. So it's important to pick up the scholarship and to, as Ms. Latanya said, really understand those systems at a granular level so you can change them. Ms. Latanya, let me tell you how much of an inspiration you are. Thank you for the work that you do. It's been a privilege sitting in this space with you. And my last thing to remind people of actually goes back to your work, Dr. K, your letter to your sons. The reality is that wounds produce narratives. If you want to understand why Black people tend to shout, why communities of color experience this wound in such a profound way, it's because of the hurt that's deeply ingrained in our psyche related to our experience in America. If you can, as the prosecutor said at the end of the Chauvin trial, George Floyd didn't die because his heart was too big. He died because Derek Chauvin's heart was too small. Open your hearts and listen to the wounds of others. Privilege that shared humanity. Read a book like Letter to My Sons, and maybe you'll better understand how we can all be a better democracy if we privilege our humanity over division.
And I'm Dr. K. Wise Whitehead, the founding director of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice. I'm the radio host of Today with Dr. K on WEAA. And as we go into this weekend where we're thinking about George Floyd and thinking about the impact that his murder had on this country, before you grab your Black Lives Matter t-shirt and you pull that banner out and you hang it back up, just stop and reflect for a moment that a little girl lost her father, that, brothers and sisters lost a relative, that when we say the names of Black people who've been killed by the police, they're real people with families and lives and histories, and they're not just slogans and t-shirts and names on a cup. And so I often like to take a moment to reflect the deep loss that their families are feeling at the moment, for those who have received any form of justice and for many that have not, from the family of Emmett Till to the family of Rodney King, the type of justice that we're talking about holding people accountable for the crimes that they commit against Black and brown people. And so I thank all of you for joining us in this space tonight. Thank you for bringing your brilliance and your wisdom and your personal experience to this space. We thank all of you for watching. A special thanks to ask you to join us next week as well. We're going to continue this conversation next Thursday for episode 8, or the kind of part 4 of our discussion. Click on the link in the chat box right now to go ahead and RSVP, or go over to mpt.org/conversations. We want to thank Independent Lens and Town Hall in a Box for partnering with us. And I want to thank again my esteemed panelists who joined me this evening. And of course, to the audience, we are in this together. The question is, what type of world are we molding and shaping so we can leave to the children of our children? Thank you so much for joining me tonight and joining all of us.